Feds, many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
And welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.TV. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're going to kind of dive into some of the economic turmoil going on right now. First one article I have out of Yahoo News. Wall Street resumes sell-off. S&P 500 lowest since September. U.S. stocks sank on Wednesday, pushing the S&P 500 to close below 1,900 for the first time since September, as investors grew anxious about weak energy prices, U.S. corporate earnings, and the global economy. All 10 S&P 500 sectors ended in the red, led by consumer discretionary shares, the healthcare sector, and technology. Selling was broad, with decliners outpacing advancing issues on the NYSE more than 7-1, and on the NASDAQ more than 6-1. All three major indexes are in correction territory. They're always in correction territory. The S&P 500 is now down 11.3% below its May 21st, 2015 closing lifetime high. At the same time, the Russell 2000 small cap index dropped 3.3%, putting it in bear market territory. The index is down 22% from its June 15 record close. Stocks had started the day higher, but sentiment turned negative when a brief rally in beaten down oil prices stalled. Growing stockpiles of oil in the United States stoked market fears about demand. We've been in capital preservation mode since the year began, and as the market has shown an inability to rally with any conviction, that's only increased the level of nervousness, said Michael James, managing director of equity trading at Wedbush Securities in Los Angeles. The market has attempted 10 intraday rallies at the outset of 2016, and each one has failed to sustain itself. The declines ended a two-day rebound for the S&P 500 and resumed the steep sell-off that began at the start of the year amid concerns about the slowdown in China and global growth. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed down 364.81 points, or 2.21%, to 16,151.41. The S&P 500 lost 48.4 points, or 2.5%. The NASDAQ dropped 159.85 points, or 3.41%. And you can read the rest of that. And that was at Yahoo News. Wall Street resumes sell-off. S&P 500 lowest since September. Um, one thing that a lot of times doesn't get addressed when we look at the economic is that we hear all the talk about the stock market. Well, the stock market's full of bubbles, and when you see the crashes, that's what's actually reflecting current situation. Is when you're at that bottom of that crash, that's where we're really at. Um, we create these bubbles that only allow the rich to get richer, and I'm talking the ultra, multinational rich people. Um, and a lot of those people know what they're doing. It's to benefit themselves, and they don't have a problem with what they would claim is your ignorance. But there are a lot of people out there that are willing and wanting to audit and end the Fed. Federal Reserve has a lot to do with our economic situation, definitely when it comes to that dollar, that almighty Federal Reserve note that you have in your pocket, um, and it having absolutely no backing and can be printed out of thin air. And when you start paying debt off with things that you make up, things that you just print off of a press with no actual backing, and you're paying off this debt to a country that has been hoarding gold so that they can eventually back their currency with gold and silver. Um, you basically are just fighting a losing battle, chasing your tail. And there's a lot of people that have come to realize really what the Federal Reserve represents. And we have one article here, Truth in Media, roll call, how U.S. senators voted on auditing the Fed. The Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2015 failed to advance on Tuesday, while the Senate voted 53 to 44 in favor of the bill. 60 votes were required for the bill to move forward. The full roll call showing how each U.S. senator voted can be seen below. Yeas were 53 again against 44 nays. Um, the yeas, Alexander, Republican, Tennessee; Ayotte, Republican, New Hampshire; Baldwin, Democrat, Wisconsin. You could go down the list. Where you really should be looking are the nays. Um, people like Corker out of Tennessee. Most nays are Democrat. You have Corker, the Republican; King, Independent. Then we also had not voting. Um, Again, surprisingly, but not surprisingly at the same time to many of us, Cruz fails to vote for audit the Fed bill. That he goes around touting that we should audit the Fed, and he doesn't show up. Including that is Coates, a Republican from Indiana, right here where I'm located, and broadcasting out of. Coates of Indiana, Republican, did not vote, and Franken, Democrat, I believe from Minnesota, didn't vote. But we did have some Democrats actually vote yay. Most of the votes were Republican. I think actually might have only been Baldwin from Wisconsin. Might have been the only Democrat that voted. But and Sanders actually voted as an independent to audit the Fed. Um, we have these people that, like Cruz, that will talk about auditing the Fed, but fails to be there to vote for this. Getting basically any chance of even coming close to that 60. If the 3 people that didn't vote would have voted for it, that would have at least been 56. And who knows, them showing up and actually voting a yay might have actually convinced a couple other people. You never know. But they just failed to vote. Now I'm going to get in this Ron Paul Liberty Report, find the real criminals out at the Fed, covering why we should be auditing the Fed. So here we go. Ron Paul Liberty Report, find the real criminals out at the Fed.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, nice to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Have a piece of legislation that's going to be voted on in the Senate today I want to talk about, but it's an issue that my congressional office and Campaign for Liberty and a lot of us have talked about for a long time. It has to do with the Federal Reserve. I've had strong belief and conviction that we need to expose the Federal Reserve. And even though that was a campaign theme in 1974 for me, and I kept working on it, there's a lot more people now that are interested in it, especially since the crisis of 2008 and 2009. So people are very interested in that. And, of course, we've had some success in the Congress. We got it to the floor and had it passed a couple times in the House. But now, today, there's a vote in the Senate. Rand has gotten that up, and McConnell has promised a vote. I think he'll stick with his promise, and it's supposed to be at 2:30 estimated time for the vote, Eastern time. So this to me is very, very important because the issue is important, and compared to when I started in the 70s, there's a lot more interest on what's going on.
Yeah, it's often thought of as kind of a niche idea. This is sort of an idea that you've owned on the campaign trail. I think people don't realize how broad this issue is. It's not about some kind of wonkish monetary policy. It's all encompassing.
No, it's very big because if anybody is concerned about the size of government, they ought to be concerned about how it's financed. And it's not financed through taxation. It's a vicious form of taxation, basically, carried out by the Federal Reserve. And I remember I got to bring this up in the debate one time. They were talking about what tax would you stop? And I said the inflation tax, because it is. It steals money out of people's pockets without them even knowing about it because they dilute the value of the money and, prices and cost of living goes up. So it is something that is used to finance debt and excessive government, and we have it every place. Most people concentrate on the wasteful welfare spending here at home, and they recognize this, especially the Republicans tend to ignore the wasteful spending, in other areas, and how we go to war. We go to war without declarations. They're numerous and constant. But I would think that we could make a pretty good case for saying that the Federal Reserve is a facilitator not only for the welfare spending, but the warfare spending as well.
That's true, and I think there are quite a few progressives who are with you on the war issue, but they may not see the connection with the Federal Reserve. I know people like Dennis Kucinich, who's on the Institute's board, definitely does, and many do. But I think a lot of them view this as completely separate to the problems of preemptive war and foreign policy. But as you pointed out earlier when we were chatting, there has never been a war that's been paid for by a tax. They never send around a bill to everyone who wants the war to pay for it.
And guess who suffers the most? It's the middle class. And when a country is very, very wealthy, and we've escaped the real tragedy of the world wars in the last century, but still the payment went with inflation, the devaluation of the dollar, and that's middle class. But now the wealth of our country is way down, thanks to the Federal Reserve and the desire for big government. It's way down. And so therefore, we're at the end of the rope. I'm convinced that due to this monetary policy in the last 15 years, it's been downhill for us, and the debt is unsustainable, and yet they will refuse to do anything about it. So I still concentrate on the Federal Reserve. I think if the people knew exactly what goes on at the Federal Reserve, that they would want reforms, true reforms, and they would have sound money, and yet the big guns come out, when they hear that there's going to be a vote. Remember when we were doing it and I was in the House, there was a lot of politicking by politicians as well as the writers and the financial stations and all the TV stations. This is terrible, terrible. And lo and behold, this vote is coming up, and our friend Ben Bernanke, I think he's retired now, but he had to write an article to blast the whole idea, about auditing the Fed. And of course, his argument is that it's already being audited, and we have this transparency, but we need independence. This is their big argument, and I want to just read one little quote here from Bernanke's article, and sort of gives us a hint that he's leading us astray. Because one thing he says, it's completely being audited, unnecessary. We don't want these politicians involved, and this is his argument. He says the bill would do this by repealing existing restrictions imposed by Congress nearly 40 years ago on what the GAO can audit when reviewing the Fed. The most important such restriction blocks the GAO from reviewing, this is what he doesn't want to happen, from reviewing deliberations, decisions, or actions of monetary matters, which is the essence of the whole thing. And he admits that it's there, and that's what we want to know. We want to know what they're doing. What about in the crisis? Yeah. Look how many people got bailed out there.
Sure, that leaves they can audit and find out what they had for lunch, and that's about all.
Yeah. So, no, this is something, because he doesn't want the Congress to have the authority, and I've always argued I don't want the Congress for the authority that the Fed has to manipulate money and interest rates. That's not what the Constitution said. Our responsibility is to guarantee that gold and silver be legal tender. So, but Congress has been delivered this authority. If you go along with the misinformed Supreme Court ruling, say give the Federal Reserve the authority to manipulate interest rates and all these other things, that's a different story. But we don't expect them to ever change their mind. They're going to continue to do this, and they want secrecy. When they talk about keeping the politicians out, what they want is total secrecy. And of course, what we would like to have is transparency to know who the beneficiaries are. And there are a lot. I mean, we can't even number them all, but it's big corporations, big banks, foreign governments, foreign central banks, the whole works, because we do live in a global economy, and the monetary system is, very important.
But what do you make of this argument that they would point out, we've got to remain independent of the president and independent of Congress?
And one Federal Reserve Board chairman spilled the beans on that, and that was Arthur Burns. And a German reporter came up to him and asked him about that, because Burns was with Nixon, and Nixon, he were buddies, and they visited almost every day, and it was all a conspiracy against the people to manipulate it and try to get Nixon reelected. They forgot about Watergate and a few other things, but that was their whole goal. But Burns said, the Fed must do exactly what the president says, or it will lose its independence. So the independence, of course, and he mocked it. He mocked it, and he was a participant in that. And this is the whole thing. But it is very politicized right now, whether it's high influence by the financiers or whatever, and powerful politicians, do have influence. The pressure of deficits. They're not going to refuse to monetize debt for food stamps, and they're not going to refuse to monetize debt for more bombs. and they're not going to refuse that. And then the Federal Reserve Board chairmen over the years always said to me, well, you're right about that, and deficits are bad, but that's your responsibility. It's Congress's responsibility. But what if they refuse to monetize it, which they would have to under sound money, because under gold or silver, you just can't print that out of thin air.
Yeah. But what do you think, what do you suspect they would find if there was a real full independent audit of the Fed? What kinds of red flags do you think would shoot up?
Well, you can speculate on that, but I think there would be a lot of special corporations who got saved and other ones went under. And they would be, I think, I'd like to see the connection with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs have a lot of influence, with the Federal Reserve. So I think, and Goldman Sachs stock is down right now since the beginning of the year. I keep thinking, could they ever get in trouble? And they were sort of saved last time. I think it would be companies like that. But I would like to see how much detail they might get involved in foreign policy. Yeah. When there's we get involved with elections, and nobody's supposed to know that. We overthrow dictators here and there, and we support them, and so they would be, and if they need finances, even Reagan did some secret financing. Whether or not the Federal Reserve was involved, we don't know, but we knew drug dealing was involved in Iran-Contra. They do this, and it's secret government. So this is secret government. The CIA is secret government, very, very thin. It'd be interesting to find out. You ask what we might find. Maybe we'd find a connection how the Federal Reserve sort of connives with the CIA and some of the shenanigans they do around the world.
That would be interesting. Also, it would be interesting to see the relationship between the Fed and the European Central Bank, especially with things like the Greece problems we saw last year. How much of a role did the Fed have in it?
Yeah, and I think they definitely were involved. I think that was sort of out in the open, but what won't be out in the open is whether there was any commitment. Sometimes there's commitments made and guarantees, and sometimes the crisis is over and they put it back together again, and it never becomes blatant. But what will happen, though, is eventually when they lose control, which that very well could happen, is that there will be such a huge monetary crisis that everything will be exposed and the system will no longer work, even for them. Right now, when you think of the amount of credit they worked with, I think it was like $15 to $16 trillion that they manipulated in the last crisis. Well, I think when confidence is lost, that's not going to work. And matter of fact, right now, these last 5-6 years since the crisis, just pumping in money hasn't solved the problem. And the Fed's main tool is to lower interest rates. Well, what do you do when they're almost zero? And then they decide, well, we have to look a little respectable, so we're going to raise them 0.25%. And look, that looks like it could have been a precipitating factor on the crisis now. But they have run out of tools, and there will be liquidation. There is deflation pressures, although there's still a lot of inflation. And there's this contest between market forces that say deflate, shrink the debt, get rid of the bad investments, and clear the air, which would be good. But no, politically that's unacceptable. So then you have the inflation people come in, and they were able to hold it together for the rich guys in these last several years, but they didn't hold the middle class together. I mean, the labor participation rate is as high as ever, and the people living on the streets in New York is as high as ever. The people on food stamps as high as ever. So they didn't do any good. What is so interesting is so many of those who are in charge sort of are leftists, and you don't think of them as neocons supporting the military. But if they truly thought, well, these people are desperate, they're underwater on their mortgages, and we have to do something else. They didn't pass out the money to those people. They passed it out to the people who were doing all the risking and made all the money. And not that is the answer. Sometimes when you make a suggestion in a cynical way, well, why didn't they just pass out the money? Maybe it's not a bad idea. And I think they're thinking along those terms now. Look at how are they going to pass out money and cover the student debt. Student debt, $1.3 trillion. Fed will come to the rescue. The only thing that holds this together is the fact that there's still trust and confidence in the dollar, and the liberals would argue that's right, and it's going to be there, and that's why we can inflate forever. So I think that it is an important issue. I think it's an important issue for foreign policy, obviously.
Well, in terms of the dollar hegemony, you're already seeing a lot of rumbling around with the BRICS countries. You're seeing alternative banks. You're seeing trading being done in yuan and this sort of thing. So there are certainly cracks in that edifice as well.
Yeah, and the economies are destined to get weaker. And there was one report, I think it was on Zero Hedge the other day, that said there was not one single vessel in the Atlantic Ocean either going east or west. And he said he didn't know if that ever happened before. I mean, could world trade be that bad and still, the stock market is down a little bit, but it's not a really big deal. But something's happening to trade, and it's freezing up, the whole system. So I think there will be an amazing conclusion to this in a negative sense. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. And once again, we're talking about the Federal Reserve and the need to audit the Fed. A vote coming up today at 2:30 Eastern Time in the Senate. If you haven't called your senator and you have time, call your senator. But if not, if it's past 2:30 and the vote has already occurred, what you ought to do is find out how your senator voted. And if they skip the vote, let them know about it. It's an important issue. People who pretend they are, on our side against the Fed and not show up for the vote, well, that's pretty important, skipping votes on something this important. And, of course, I have been wanting these votes. This vote probably won't pass. The bill won't pass in the Senate today. If it did, it would be a miracle. But then again, it will never be signed by the president. But it'll be very interesting to see how many votes we get. And one thing for sure, this issue is still on the table, no matter how many former Federal Reserve Board chairman writes and say, well, we don't want this transparency. We need our secrecy, which is the way I form it. Though they will keep coming out and keep doing it. But the law of economics, the principle of economics, and the understanding of monetary policy is so much on our side that you can't print money forever and maintain a currency. It's never happened in the history of mankind. And gold and silver as money has been around for 6,000 years. And I'm sort of leaning toward believing that it's going to remain money for a long time to come. We just have to alert the American people. Generally speaking, throughout history, when the people know and have a vote, upright vote on sound currency or paper currency, they vote for sound money. And I think that that is what we're coming close to, because certainly the Fed is on the receiving side of more criticism today than ever before, and that is very, very healthy. So maybe the true reforms that we need just around the corner. Hopefully so. Stay tuned and keep an eye on the Fed. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube, and RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Go check them out and subscribe. And, that's really getting behind our monetary policy and how our dollar is devalued. They can continue to just sit there and print more. And every time they do that, it devalues the money in your pocket, plus the borrowing, and then trying to pay back with money that isn't backed by anything. And it was never supposed to be like this. The Federal Reserve is a private-owned bank. It is not part of the government. It has the sole ability to print the U.S. currency, and how much they actually print, how much they might invest in other countries, or anything for that fact. You don't really truly know what's going on unless you have a full audit of the Fed. And we see again and again that there are plenty of people that don't want that exposed, and they will vote against it. That anyone voting against it, they either know that it's corrupt and they know by allowing a full audit of the Fed and that corrupt it will collapse the country, or they are doing it just because they believe that government should hide everything it does from the public, which we know that there are politicians out there that do think this way. They look at the government as a way to control people. Therefore, what they do must be kept secret and propaganda put out to justify things. Now I have an article here, the freethoughtproject.com. Sell everything. Top mega banks warn that a cataclysmic collapse has begun. After years of giveaways to mega banks marketed to the taxpayers as quantitative easing, the crutches shoved under the banker-controlled global stock trade are about to snap. In June of 2015, former Congressman Ron Paul predicted that these crutches would fail and the financial bubbles created by them would send the stock market into a free fall. Quote, the consequences will not be minor, surprises will be many, since we are in uncertain waters and the world has never faced the gross misallocation of capital that exists today. The process is self-limiting. It will come to an end and it's not going to be far into the future. Now, just 6 months later, he's being proven right. In an eerily ominous note to its clients, the Royal Bank of Scotland has warned its investors of a cataclysmic year. In the note, the RBS said, quote, sell everything except high-quality bonds. This is about return of capital, not return on capital. In a crowded hall, exit doors are small, unquote. Last week, the Chinese market opened in free fall. In an attempt to stave off the collapse, Chinese authorities effectively shut down all trading by the use of so-called circuit breakers. On Monday and Thursday of last week, all trading was suspended in the Chinese market, a telltale sign of things to come. Well, I think the world is nowhere close to where our fairly cataclysmic year ahead stands, and feedback from investors suggests such, unquote. RBS credit chief Andrew Roberts told investors. China has set off major correction and it's going to snowball. Equities and credit have become very dangerous and we have hardly even begun to retrace the Goldilocks loving of the last 2 years. In the note, Roberts goes on to point out how quantitative easing has failed and was expected to fail. Quote, we have been told for 7 years now since the credit crunch under QE to borrow money and invest it in one of three things. 1, EM, 2, credit, 3, global equities. This is a big picture, multi-year bet that has been taken, which has worked fine and stopped working 10 months ago. This is not new, unquote. RBS is not the only mega bank to predict a collapse either. Analysis at JP Morgan had advised clients to sell all stocks on any bounce. Our view is that the risk reward for equities has worsened materially. In contrast to the past 7 years, when we've advocated using the dips as buying opportunities, we believe the regime has transitioned to one of selling any rally. Mislav Matejka, an equity strategist at JP Morgan, said in a report on Monday, Morgan Stanley also Pearsley predicted the price of oil to drop to $20 a barrel in the coming months. As The Guardian's Larry Elliott points out, markets have been supported for some time by low interest rate stimulus measures from central banks, including quantitative easing in hopes of economic recovery. But with the Federal Reserve raising rates and the Bank of England expected to follow suit, that prop is being removed. Those who pay attention to the effects of central bankers looting their respective countries have long pointed out that the mathematical certainty that is an economic collapse. The collapse of global markets is inevitable, as it is a natural correction to the wholesale fleecing of the citizens through the unscrupulous actions of central banks. Ron Paul sums up the situation perfectly. Quote, the credit and new money, when created by central banks, is delivered to the market in a political fashion for which 1% receive special benefits. It allows the pyramiding of debt to fractional reserve banking, which compounds long-term problems. It may be fun while it lasts, but it always ends with a crash. Unquote. Matt Agorist. Follow Matt Agorist at Matt Agorist. That's who wrote that article at thefreethoughtproject.com. So we definitely are looking at a economic problem that I believe is going to really start affecting us. And you're seeing articles everywhere talking about prepare for this economic crash. Now let me pull something up here. First, I wanted to give you the price of Bitcoin right now. And right now, Bitcoin is trading at 432.75. And it's actually kind of down from some of its ups. But in 1 year, if you look at a 1 year low, was at 160.54. And within a year, it's went from 160.54 to 434.95. Now, that partially has to do with the currency problem we're going through right now, the Federal Reserve note. But people are like, well, why is gold and silver going down? Why is gold and silver going down? Well, it's another bubble that's been created. This bubble that's been created is the oil price. Now, why are oil prices going low? A lot of the evidence tends to show that there is a, now, mind you, there's other so-called libertarians out there. It's because of fracking. Fracking is doing such a good job. No, it really has nothing to do with fracking. This has to do with Saudi Arabia. This has to do with OPEC. This has to do with crashing the fracking industry by making oil so cheap because they can afford to. because their oil is very close to the surface. It's not hard for them to get, while we have to frack to get ours. They are making it where fracking is not affordable to do. They're making it where to research, do all the research that they need and exploration, and then the actual fracking itself, time they do all this, they will not be able to compete in the oil market. Well, gold and silver are highly tied to commodities. But because this is a bubble, this is also a bubble for all other commodities, where it's been artificially keeping those commodities down in price because oil is down in price. But again, this is a purposely made bubble to do this, and eventually you're going to see those oil prices go back up. One, they're going to go back up because the dollar's been devalued. Two, they're going to go back up because the fracking industry will be hurting. And the foreign companies will raise their oil prices and, not ship out as much oil, artificially raise them, which will then pop that bubble. But because of the turmoil in the stock market, it will also affect how people start perceiving gold and silver again. So now that we have the stock market down, we're looking at a change of 0.78% in gold and a change in 2.68% in silver. That's in gold, it's per ounce plus $8.47, and in silver that's 37.37. So we are now seeing gold and silver kind of react to what the stock market's doing. Plus, the demand of it is been going up, even though the prices have been down again. A lot of that's due to the artificial lowering of the price of oil and the commodities tie that gold, silver, lumber and agricultural things have very, very close ties because they're all commodities. A lot of the stock trading is in commodities and diverse throughout. A lot of 401ks, if they deal in commodities, it will have a diverse selection in those commodities. So it all ties together. And, I've seen other ones. China's banks could be the next big problem. Russia aims to break Wall Street's monopoly on oil prices. Again, Russia, China, I think are working together to create a new petrodollar in the yuan, whatever you call it, over in China. There's the article out. Silver gains as Fed may raise rates at slower than expected pace. But I do want to get into this next clip here. And sorry, I'm having a little bit of issue here. This one's from Christopher Green out of Alternative Media TV. And he believes that economic collapse may lead to a nuclear event. Now, I don't quite share all of what he says in this, but it's something that I think we should look at this angle. And when I tell people and warn people, be prepared for it's not believing everything you hear. It's researching and looking at some of the truths in what people say and how they might be relevant in your belief and what you see as the truth of what may happen. So, there's a lot of things that can spark off a economic collapse, and there's also a lot of things that can spark off wars. Now, I don't believe that we're going to see any type of nuclear event, but hey, I could be wrong. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I think with that we should be prepared. Look at what happened with Fukushima. That in itself should tell you, you don't know what can happen tomorrow. And I do believe that there are a lot of effects being seen, definitely the farther west you go here in the United States, that are related to Fukushima. So let's go ahead and dive into this. Economic collapse leads to nuclear event. Christopher Green of AMTV. Okay, this doesn't seem like it's going to load, so I think we'll just go ahead and skip that one for now. But I do have a Peter Schiff Deja Vu all over again that I can play. Give me a second here. Now, I'm not going to play this whole thing, so let me get to the point where I wanted to. Now, we're going to start off right around where he starts talking about hourly wages and the reports that are out. And again, I'm not playing all this, and we're already starting way into this clip. But I want to talk about some of what he talks about here.
The last month of the year. And of course, December is going to include a lot of part-time jobs because people are hiring for the Christmas season. I mean, how many Santa Clauses do you think all the department stores had to hire for the month of December? Those jobs are in there, right? But anyway, we were supposed to create 200,000 jobs. That was the consensus. And we came in at 292,000. I mean, way above estimates. But not only did we beat the estimate, but they went back to the prior 2 months and they revised those up about 50,000 a month each. So we actually got about 200,000 more jobs in the quarter than people had anticipated. Now, the unemployment rate held steady at 5%. The only blemish on this report was our average hourly earnings, which were actually down slightly instead of up 0.2%, which was the forecast. So this was the data point that people point to and say, oh, the U.S. economy is strong because look at all this job growth. But again, all this is backward looking, and all these jobs are going to go away because all of the other data, including data that came out today, shows how weak the economy really is. And of course, it doesn't even make sense if the Atlanta Fed is right. If GDP is barely above zero, how is an economy that's barely growing creating all these jobs? I mean, none of that makes sense. Now, all the data that came out earlier in the week was also bad, but I don't want to get into that in this video blog because I already discussed it in 2 podcasts that I recorded earlier in the week. So if you haven't listened to those, go to Shift Radio and listen to my 2 most recent podcasts where I go over in depth all the economic data that came out earlier in the week prior to the fact that we got this jobs report on Friday. But we got 2 other reports today that, again, no one's going to talk about these reports because they're bad and because nobody cares. One of them was on wholesale trade. And wholesale trade numbers were bad. And in fact, this is one of the reasons that the Atlanta Fed revised down their GDP forecast today was because of these bad numbers on wholesale trade. They were expecting a flat number for November. Instead, we got -0.3%. And they went and they revised down the number for the prior month from -0.1 to -0.3. But the biggest problem was that inventories were declining on a wholesale level, mainly because sales were declining even faster. I mean, inventories went down, but sales went down even faster. So the inventory to sales ratio actually went up, despite the fact that inventories went down. It's now at 1.32. This is the highest it's been since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. In fact, the only other time that we have been this high in the last 15 years or so was in 2001 when we were also in a recession. In fact, there is a lot of data that came out this week where we have not seen data this bad unless we were in a recession. So 1 or 2 things are possible. We're actually in a recession, which makes sense because we have all this data that we have never seen unless we were in a recession, or there's something really weird about this recovery where it's a recovery that actually looks like a recession. Now, to me, it makes sense that if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's a duck. And this recovery looks like a recession and quacks like a recession and walks like a recession. So you know what? It probably is a recession. It's just that the Fed doesn't want to admit it. Because the minute the Fed has to admit it's a recession, they have to admit that their policy didn't work. See, meanwhile, Ben Bernanke wrote a book, The Courage to Act. And of course, I said he should have called it The Coward's Way Out. But he's did a whole book tour proclaiming victory, right? Everything is fine. Well, if the Fed has to go back to zero, then that proves that it's not. I mean, the raising of interest rates was supposed to be the icing on the cake, right? The economy is great, and we're going to prove it by raising rates. See, one of the reasons I thought they wouldn't raise rates is because they could pretend that they could. Because the minute they actually raise interest rates, they prove they can't. See, they wanted to pretend the economy was strong enough to withstand a rate hike, but I knew if they actually raised rates, they would prove that it wasn't, and that is exactly what's happening. And, the economy was already slowing down before the rate hike, right? Now, they're just accelerating the process. Now, the other weak number we got today was consumer credit. And consumer credit was supposed to expand. They were looking for $18.8 billion. Instead, we got growth of just $14 billion. Right? That's the lowest of the year. And if you look at auto loans, the growth of those, that's the lowest in 4 years. And there's all sorts of evidence that the auto bubble has burst. I mean, I discussed that in my other podcasts earlier this week. But there's ample evidence that Federal Reserve-induced bubble in basically subprime auto loans and auto buying has burst. I mean, the evidence is crystal clear. And, of course, a lot of this phony recovery was based on people buying cars they couldn't afford with cheap credit. And as this bubble bursts and all these automobiles are piling up on showrooms that nobody could buy anymore, there's going to be massive layoffs in the auto sector. There's going to be massive layoffs in the supply chain. Not only there, I was saying all last year that I thought we were going to have a bad holiday season for the retailers and that the layoffs were going to begin early in 2016. And sure enough, Macy's, who has reported lousy results, announced massive layoffs earlier this week. And of course, more layoffs are coming. Look, the Gap came out today with bad earnings at Old Navy. The stock price was down 15% on the day. I think it's back down to where it was it's almost at the same price as 2004, 2005. It's not quite at its 2009 low yet, but it could be there very soon. But all these retailers are blowing up. In fact, the financials are starting to blow up. We're seeing layoffs there. And so it's only a matter of time before we start to see some negative non-farm payroll numbers. But of course, by then it's too late to avoid the recession. We're going to be knee deep in it. One of the most ridiculous excuses I heard today as to why, nothing that's happening internationally matters was from Steve Leisman, the senior economist over at CNBC. And, never believe anything that comes from a television economist. But he was trying to reassure the CNBC audience that we have nothing to worry about from what's going on overseas. Now, I don't believe that our stock market is falling because foreign stock markets are falling, but they do. And what Leisman was trying to say was, hey, we don't have to worry. Just because things are bad overseas doesn't mean they're going to be bad here, because we are the least globally dependent economy in the world. This is what he said. He basically said that we're an island unto ourselves. We're self-sustaining and self-sufficient. And so it doesn't matter what's happening in other economies because we don't need any other economies. We can function on our own. Now, he acknowledged that that might not be the case for the stock market, right? Because obviously we have a lot of multinational companies, and clearly what happens internationally affects those companies. And he acknowledged that. But he said the U.S. economy is a different story, and the stock market is not the economy, and the economy can be fine because it doesn't matter what happens overseas because, we're so self-sufficient and we don't really care. We don't depend on anybody else. And that is such a laugh because not only is that not true, it couldn't be further from the truth because the United States is probably the most economically dependent country in the history of the world. I mean, think about it. We run trade deficits of about $500 billion a year, a little bit more. So every 2 years, we have to borrow over $1 trillion from the world. We depend on the world for all the goods that we're consuming. All these consumer goods come from other countries. I mean, to say that we are independent, imagine what it would be like in America if we didn't have any foreign products, if we could only consume the products we produced ourselves. I mean, how different would life be in America? I mean, is it possible that we could begin making some of the products that we're now importing? Sure, but they might cost 2 or 3 times as much. How many people can afford to buy them? Our standard of living would collapse if it wasn't for the rest of the world supplying us with all these goods at prices that we could never produce the goods for ourselves. Also, what about all the money we borrow? Right? Americans can't spend if they can't borrow. Where's all that money coming from? We don't save anything. It's the rest of the world that does the saving for us. So they loan us the money that we spend, and they produce the goods that we consume. Yet Steve Leisman thinks that we're completely independent of the rest of the world, and it doesn't matter what happens. Of course it matters. And what's ultimately going to happen is when the Federal Reserve is forced to acknowledge, for whatever reason, that we are back in recession, and they have got to rev up those printing presses once again, and in an even bigger way. Because remember, when the Fed screws up an economy by keeping interest rates artificially low, right, the lower they are, for the longer they remain there, the more screwed up the economy gets. And it was pretty screwed up during the financial crisis. I mean, imagine, how much worse it's going to be now. Because Alan Greenspan, he had interest rates at 1%, kept them there for, a year and a half, and then he slowly raised them back up to 5%. And during that period of time, he did so much damage to the economy that, we had the financial crisis of 2008, and it was almost a repeat of the Great Depression. Well, imagine the extent of the damage that's been done in the last 7 years. I mean, 7 years of 0% interest rates with a balance sheet of $4.5 trillion. I mean, this is on a level that it's like on a Richter scale level, where it's the damage that the Fed has done is a multiple of what it was before. So this next crisis is going to require a much bigger round of stimulus than the last, if that's even possible. But I don't think it is, because I think the next round of stimulus is going to be the one that we overdose on, right? The real reason that the stock market is tanking and the economy is headed back into recession, it's not because of North Korea. It's not because of China. It's because the Federal Reserve is taking the heroin away, the monetary heroin away from the drug addicts. And even though they're still giving us some heroin, because after all, interest rates are barely above zero, the problem is it's not enough because they got everybody addicted to an even bigger dose. And now that they've tried to dial back the dosage, it isn't working. And the withdrawal is already setting in. But the problem is the amount of monetary heroin they're going to have to inject in everybody's system to try to stimulate us back from this is going to be a lethal dose. And when I mean lethal, I mean to the currency and then ultimately the economy. And that is the biggest irony because the dollar has had this huge rally because everybody believes that this recovery is genuine. Everybody believes that what the Fed did worked. You know, just like they believed everything was great in 1999, early 2000, or just like they believed it was great at the end of 07 or early 08. It's the same people making the same mistake because it's the same problem, only bigger. The Fed didn't solve the problem. It created the problem, and then it covered it up and made it much bigger. And the consequences are about to materialize when we get this reversal. And I think the reversal in the foreign exchange market, in the commodity market, in the gold market is going to be very sharp because people are all going to come to the same conclusion at the same time. And everybody is on the wrong side of the trade. Everybody is positioned for the wrong outcome. And when they realize how wrong they are and that they have to reposition, it's impossible because everybody's coming to that same conclusion at once and the bottom drops out of the market and you see these huge, huge moves in a very short period of time. Well, given that the stock market closed on the low of the week and it is a Friday, there is a potential for a follow-through decline on Monday. And, of course, there could be a lot more weakness coming throughout the remainder of the month. You know, there's an old adage on Wall Street, so goes January, so goes the rest of the year. And generally, the month of January is determined by the first week. And the first week generally gets determined by the first day. And so far, the first day of January was a very good indicator for the first week. And the first week is probably going to be a good indicator for the first month and the first year. And again, the only thing that I believe will stop a full-fledged bear market, and not just a regular bear market, a vicious bear market. Remember, the last two times that Fed bubbles burst, the Dow lost about half its value. And so I think this market would lose at least half of its value, if not more, if the Fed actually were to follow through with its promised rate hikes. The only reason I think that the downside will be limited to maybe 20% is because I believe the Fed is not going to follow through with these rate hikes. I believe that they're going to reduce rates back to zero and launch QE4. The only question is, how much more is the Fed going to allow? How much more pain is the Fed going to allow? And how much longer is the Fed going to deny that the recession is coming in order to save face and to pretend that A, that their policies worked, and that B, that their forecast was correct and the decision to raise rates was a prudent one. So keep tuning in. Make sure to listen to my podcast because I'll probably do several of them next week, and there's going to be a lot going on, and you're going to want to get my take on the markets, on the economy throughout the week. You're not going to want to.
Peter Schiff, you can subscribe Peter Schiff on YouTube. Check him out. And that was part of the Peter Schiff report, Deja Vu all over again. Now, when we look at this, so we're looking at a continuum of something that really has been going on for a long time, but from the creation of the Federal Reserve to where we're at now and the setting of the interest rates and all this, they're either really ignorant to the fact that they can't control the economy, or they're purposely doing it to extract wealth out of the country and for their own personal gains. So we really do need an audit of the Fed, which, again, did not pass because we did not get the 60 votes required to get it passed, but we did get 53 to 44, yay versus nay. Now, we're going to move along out of the economy arena and get a little bit into the political area now. Let me go ahead and pull up this Politico article that I came across. This one again out of Politico. Rand Paul mounts last minute push to get back on main debate stage. The Kentucky senator is lobbying Fox Business after a new poll shows he would have qualified if it had been immediately released. Rand Paul is making a last-minute push to get on the main stage at Thursday's GOP primary debate after a new poll showed he would have qualified if the survey results were not held for 2 days before being released. The Kentucky senator's campaign said it has been in touch with Fox Business, the debate organizer, about the new poll and expect to hear from them soon. Paul has failed to catch fire like some of the other fellow GOP presidential candidates, but Fox Business Network's decision to boot him for the first time off the main stage at Thursday night's debate in South Carolina was a potential knockout punch for his flailing candidacy. The network made that decision based on Paul's standing in public polls. Fox Business had said last month that the top 6 candidates in the 5 most recent national polls as of Monday evening would make the main stage, joined by any other candidates who appeared in the top 5 in either Iowa or New Hampshire, the 2 states that vote first in the nominating process. Paul was in 7th place in all 3 averages, according to Politico's calculations. But a new Des Moines Register Bloomberg Politics poll in Iowa released Wednesday morning has Paul at 5%, alone in 5th place. In fact, if the Des Moines Register poll is included on the list of the 5 most recent polls, it gets Paul into a tie for 5th place with former Florida Governor Jeb Bush at 4.2%. That presumably would get Paul onto the main stage. It's true that the Des Moines Register Bloomberg Politics poll was released 36 hours after Fox Business deadline for inclusion, but it was conducted January 7th through the 10th, entirely before the qualification deadline. Other polls from American Research Group, January 6th through 10th, and Quinnipiac University, January 5th through the 10th, conducted through Sunday, were released on Monday afternoon, January 11th, and made it into the Fox Business average. Quite simply, had the Register and Bloomberg's released their poll, which was completed Sunday on Monday at 5:59 instead of Wednesday at 6 a.m., Paul would likely have qualified for the main stage. With the new Des Moines Register poll, it's clear that we met all the criteria for the debate, Paul told Politico, and we hope that there will be a reevaluation, including the Des Moines Register poll in the reevaluation. But so far, Fox Business isn't backing down. We announced the criteria in December and clearly stated the polling needed to be conducted and released by Monday, January 11th at 6 p.m. A Fox Business spokesman told Politico Wednesday morning. Paul has declined to participate in the undercard debate. The candidates set to be on the main stage are Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, Mark Rubio, Ben Carson, Chris Christie, John Kasich, and Bush. Really? Nolan D. McCaskill contributed to this report. Really? Now, Rand Paul for president issued a statement on the Fox Business debate. And here's a statement. By any reasonable criteria, Senator Paul has a top-tier campaign. He will not let the media decide the tiers of this race and will instead take his message directly to the voters of New Hampshire and Iowa. Multiple national polls, including CNN, CBS, Fox, Morris, and others, have him in 5th or 6th place. One had him just a single point out of 4th. Multiple polls, he scores ahead of Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, John Kasich, and Carly Fiorina. In yesterday's Morris Iowa poll, he was alone in 5th place. In fact, his numbers are on the rise in recent weeks. Even the pollsters are concerned that the media is using their polls incorrectly. Polls are at best an estimation and include a standard of error that the media and the RNC are ignoring. A poll number of 5 is no different than a poll number of 8 if the standard of error is plus or minus 3. To exclude candidates on faulty analysis is to disenfranchise the voter. Creating tiers based on the electoral results of real votes might make sense, but creating tiers on bad science is irresponsible. This race is hitting its final stretch, and Rand Paul is in it to win it. He is on the ballot in every state. He has over 1,000 precinct captains in Iowa and a huge 500-person leadership team in New Hampshire. He is an important voice and has a unique message to share. He will hit the ground running this week to double down on his efforts to talk straight to the voters. See you in New Hampshire and Iowa. And he posted that. He posted it multiple times, but that one's January 11th. Now I wanted to cover another article here, or actually a clip here. Seen this on Drudge about Paul boycotting the debate because he will not be on the second tier. And it's bullshit. Rand Paul be on the stage Thursday. And it says here, though, Rand Paul will not participate in any debate where his campaign is not considered first tier. Rand Paul will boycott the Republican debate Thursday night in South Carolina after being dropped from the main stage. Senator Paul told CNN's Wolf Blitzer, I won't participate in anything that's not first tier because we have a first tier campaign. Paul went on to say, you want war? We'll give it to you. So we'll play that clip here.
I don't think the media should have the power to predetermine elections. And I think that it's a significant thing to try to tell voters you're either in the first tier or a second tier. And I think the polls have been wildly inaccurate. But even just last week, CBS had a poll and I was 1 point out of 4th place. The last 5 or 6 polls, I've been in the top 5 or 6 in all of them. So it would be very, very arbitrary to exclude me from it. And we just won't take the bait. We're not going to be designated by any media outlet as not being able to compete in the election.
Well, they're supposed to announce momentarily, Fox, who's on the main stage. I assume somebody has already informed you whether or not you're going to be on the main stage or relegated to the undercard, as it's called.
Yeah, we were just told that they have a mathematical problem over there and they're adding the numbers. And we think they're confused because they're not including us on the main stage. And we think they're really wrong with that because if you look at the poll numbers, the last half a dozen polls that have come out, we've been in either 5th or 6th or 1 point away from 4. But we think that it's a big mistake to do it, and we do not think that anyone should really be able to characterize our campaign as anything less than first tier.
So that means you will not go to that debate. You won't be in the so-called undercard.
No,
debate.
I think an artificial designation as being in the second tier is something that we don't want to accept that, because it really sort of points fingers and says, well, are you really going to be a contender? We are a contender. We think we have a national campaign that can contend for victory, and we can't accept sort of an artificial designation by anybody.
So you won't attend this debate. You won't be in the undercard. I just want to be precise.
Absolutely. I won't participate in anything that's not the first tier, because we have a first tier campaign.
And you notified Fox of that.
We've let them know that.
So you heard it there on Wolf Blitzer. Now, give me a second here. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm trying to get this loaded up here. I'm going to play this clip from Fox News. The people that kicked him off, well, Fox Business, Fox, kicked him off while talking about this poll. I guess they don't talk about when they show it. But again, you got someone that we've seen what happened to his father, and they're playing the game with him too. But see, there's also a disconnect with the average voter, even the average, Republican voter. They don't understand the whole caucusing of people and having enough people in the positions that you have the votes when the national convention's there. And Rand Paul has actually taken the steps to do that. This was something that Ron Paul was able to do. But we also seen the manipulation at the national convention. And we know that if the GOP doesn't want someone to be a candidate, they make sure that someone doesn't become that candidate. So if you see Donald Trump become a candidate, it's because they want him to become a candidate. If you see anybody, you'll see the manipulation. Again, he put out the statement. Again, let me pull up this numbers here. If I can find it. I might have lost it. But it's somewhere like 1,000 in Iowa, 500 in New Hampshire. And he's put out a very, very strong ground force that could potentially put him towards the top. Not just in some non-science poll. But we'll try to keep you updated about this blackout. And you got people go, Ted Cruz, he's a Tea Partyist. Ted Cruz didn't show up to vote for an audit the Fed. Just to make it clear. Just to point that out. Wife works for Goldman Sachs. Let me bring up this article that I came across here. I've seen this on DC Clothesline. Can you handle the truth? Ted and Heidi Cruz and the North American Union. There's an editor's note and all that, but it says here, Senator Ted Cruz met his wife Heidi while working on the George W. Bush presidential campaign of 2000. Heidi Cruz is currently head of the Southwest region in the investment management division of Goldman Sachs and Company, and previously worked in the White House for Condoleezza Rice and in New York as an investment banker for J.P. Morgan. Wikipedia lists Heidi Nelson Cruz as an investment banker and a historical member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Heidi Cruz was a member of CFR-sponsored independent task force on the future of North America, which was launched in October 2004. The task force advocates a greater economic and social integration between Canada, Mexico, and the United States as a North American region. Comprised of a group of prominent business, political, and academic leaders from the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, the task force was organized and sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations, U.S., and the Canadian Council of Chief Executives and the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. It was co-chaired by former Canadian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance John Manley, former Finance Minister of Mexico Pedro Aspe, and former Governor of Massachusetts and Assistant U.S. Attorney General William F. Weld. Its main publication is the 70-page task force report, number 53, entitled Building a North American Community. Heidi Cruz is listed as a member of the task force, page 9 of the report, and described as an energy investment banker with Merrill Lynch in Houston, Texas, who served in the Bush White House under Dr. Condoleezza Rice as the economic director for the Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council, as the director of the Latin American office at the U.S. Treasury Department, and Special Assistant Ambassador Robert B. Zoellick, U.S. Trade Representative. And it goes on, but, there might be a few connections there that might have a reason to play into why maybe Ted Cruz might have decided not to go to the vote. Possibly. Opinion. But, when a lot of these groups and task force or what have created so much distrust in government, can you really expect to trust them in these positions when they have so close connections? These are the connections that we've had problems with. Why is Goldman Sachs always connected with politics? Why does it seem that they're always in everything? J.P. Morgan, these banks are too big to fail. All these people have these immunities that the normal everyday citizen doesn't have. They get propped up by the government because the government is bought them. When they buy these politicians, put them in government basically has been bought. You know, how am I supposed to look at Cruz and go, you know, well, he won't cater to any of those groups? Okay. Wanted to play this this reality check, Ben Swan reality check, and this one is titled, "Is President Obama all talk when it comes to enforcing gun prosecutions?"
President Obama has announced a series of executive actions on gun control. He says he wants to end gun violence running rampant in the United States. But is it a fair question to ask? Is the president all talk on this issue? And do actions by his administration speak louder than his words? This is a reality check you won't see anywhere else.
How did we get here? How did we get to the place where people think requiring a comprehensive background check means taking away people's guns? Congress still needs to act. The folks in this room will not rest until Congress does.
Well, you heard the speech, President Obama making very clear on Tuesday that he wants comprehensive gun control reform on a series of levels, and if Congress will not act, he will act alone. In fact, the president laid out a series of executive actions, including a mandate that anyone who sells firearms at all, including online or at gun shows, has to obtain a license and perform background checks. Mandate background checks when guns are purchased through a trust or a corporation, and also improving criminal record sharing between states to beef up the nation's background check system. The president says his administration will hire 200 more ATF agents and 230 more Naval Criminal Investigative Service examiners to enforce gun regulations.
And from first graders in Newtown, first graders, and from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun. Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad. And by the way, it happens on the streets of Chicago every day.
Yeah, clearly the president getting very emotional there, but let's take the emotion out of this and let's talk about some numbers. Because here's the real question. If the president wants so badly to do something about gun violence, why is his administration and his Justice Department not enforcing existing gun laws? In 2013, President Obama outlined 23 executive actions aimed at amping up prosecutions of federal gun laws. Maybe even more surprising, you heard President Obama talk about Chicago and Newtown when he became emotional. Well, get this. In 2014, in Chicago, over 2,500 people were shot, nearly 400 of them fatally. Police seized more than 6,252 guns. Yet out of those 6,252 guns seized, federal prosecutors saw fit to pursue just 62 weapons prosecutions. In other words, for every 100 guns police seized, federal prosecutors made just one prosecution. And yet, that same year, in 2013, President Obama's Justice Department actually began slowing down on prosecutions for federal gun violations. That, according to a study by Syracuse University. In fact, according to the university's track reports, prosecutions in 2013 were lower than they were in 2012. Get this, crime prosecutions dropped even lower in 2014. And actually, believe it or not, they hit an all-time low for the Obama administration in 2015. So how much of a drop are we talking here? It is a 15.5% drop in federal gun prosecutions between 2010 and 2015. What's more, it is significantly lower, 34.8% drop between President Obama and the Justice Department under President Bush in 2004. So what you need to know is that while the president seems to be creating new laws with executive orders, which is completely unconstitutional, he has a lot of ability to enforce existing laws through the Justice Department. The fact that every year for the past 3 years that has happened less frequently, well, that should be alarming to anyone who believes that we need more gun control. That's Reality Check. Let's talk about that tonight on Twitter.
So, did you get what he pointed out there? Basically, while he's using the mass shooting that has happened, here and there throughout the years, at the same time, the Justice Department is prosecuting less and less actual crimes with firearms. And then there are shootings that are in self-defense that people are investigated and drugged through court over. He didn't point that out, but I've seen statistics that point and seen stories that point to, well, we're going to criticize you more because, well, you legally have a firearm, and that should be suspicious, I guess. I don't know. But it's almost like they want to create the environment to push for these executive unconstitutional actions. Now, I realize we're already at 7:30. Tonight's broadcast is going pretty fast. I'm going to play part of this. Executive order will background check solve the gun problem. I'm Ron Paul, Liberty Report. I don't think I'm going to play the whole thing. I want to talk about this because it's really important because, the saying about, Second Amendment is what protects the rest of them. And there is a truth to that. So it's really important that we preserve the right to self-defense with whatever means necessary if you are under threat and your life is under threat. So let's go ahead and dive into this.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, nice to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Good to see you.
Well, good. We have with us today our friend Adam Dick, who's certainly worked with us in the congressional office for a good many years, and he was the guy to go to if we had a civil libertarian issues, and he keeps up to date on that, and especially as it's related to guns. And today we want to talk about the issue of the right to own guns and the Second Amendment. But, that's a clear-cut right, even though the left wants to, muddy the waters there. But not only do they muddy the waters and make it confusing, but so often, in order to deal with the gun violence in our society, and obviously there is a lot of gun violence, they go and they further expand their abuse of civil liberties to other groups. So this is an issue that hopefully we can explore today.
And especially in the context of the president's executive order that we've...
Right, on the background check. So Adam, thank you for being with us today. Why don't you give us your opinion about what you think of those background checks of the president and how much good or harm they might do?
Well, I think they will definitely do harm. the background check system is a violation of several parts of the Bill of Rights. I mean, most obviously the Second Amendment, but as Andrew Napolitano pointed out earlier this year, it's also a violation of the First Amendment because it compels people to speak, to provide information about themselves. There's over 20 questions, including questions about your mental health history that you have to answer, questions about domestic violence, and questions about illegal drug use included in there, including a request for your social security number and other information. So it's compelling speech. At the same time, it could be seen as a violation of the right against self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment, because you have to provide evidence against yourself in order to acquire a gun. And also it's the 10th Amendment, because the requirement to provide this information, the ability of the U.S. government to have gun control in general, is not something that's explicitly stated as a power of the federal government under the Constitution. If anybody has that power, it would be the state or local governments. But even state governments have their own Second Amendment, so it would be questionable for them to even employ this sort of tactic to try to prevent people from having guns. Now, what Obama wants to do is he wants to expand this even more. He wants to require more people now who do private transactions, who just sell a gun here or there, to have to be licensed and thus have the background checks filled out. As he states in his executive order, if these individuals are not licensed and do not complete the background checks and the government determines they should, they could be subject to fines of $250,000 and 10 years in prison. So the penalties are quite severe.
This makes the point, what he wants to attack is personal economic transactions between two individuals, and that is people exchanging and money for owning a gun, and he wants to stop that. So that's an attack on a voluntary, peaceful exchange. But they never apply the same principle to a social association. Anything goes, and rightfully so, if there's no harm and if it's peaceful socially, whether it's religious or personal habits, that is permissible. But to me, it's so amazing, that they don't see that the personal thing is in many ways related to the economics, and they should be one and the same. It's only the libertarian that sees it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Adam, as you point out then, so under this executive order, if I had a gun that you liked and you had a gun that I liked and we decided to exchange guns like this, we would have to have some sort of a license as dealers? Is that under the new executive order?
Well, likely not if it's just that one transaction. If you have more transactions, it'll get more iffy. There's a certain amount of predictability that people have under the law now to understand whether they have to get the license or not. By changing it around and telling his individuals in the Department of Justice to be more proactive in seeking out people to prosecute, he's creating a lot of ambiguity. So more people can be subjected to penalties, and more people will be subject to the prosecutions. He's also increasing the amount of resources put into enforcement. There will be 230 new people he wants in the ATF who will be in charge with enforcement of all these background check policies and gun laws, and 200 new FBI agents. So even if he didn't expand the gun control requirements, by adding more people into the enforcement side of it, he can ensure that there's more prosecutions, more penalty, and more restrictions on gun freedom.
The other thing that I noticed in this whole argument is that the Second Amendment is written rather clearly, although the organization of the amendment might be better written for today's people. But the one thing that the left tries to do is emphasize that this is a right of the militia to own guns and not a citizen, which challenges the concept of who has rights. Governments don't have rights. Militias don't have rights. Because there's a need to be a militia, that doesn't grant a right to an individual. It starts with a right to the individual. The individual has to have the right to own a gun for a purpose, and that is to have a well-regulated militia. Otherwise, you can't have a militia. But what is most interesting, I think, in the Second Amendment, the purpose of that is to protect the free state and for the security of a free state. And they weren't talking about the federal government. They were talking about an individual state, that the people had to have these rights. It was not a collective right under the militia, and yet all they do is they start with, oh, the militia, yeah, that's legal, but that doesn't grant rights to the individual. So they're saying, if you argue that the right came from the fact, even a relative right came from the fact that there's a legal right for the state to have a militia.
Yeah. Doesn't make sense.
So, but I think the Constitution is rather clear on this, on who should have the jurisdiction. If you take Article 1, Section 1, all legislation is supposed to be in the Congress, which we know nobody pays any attention to. And then if you look at the First Amendment, the Congress shall make no law regarding, and they list several things. And of course, I think the Second Amendment is that same way. So I think that, there's no doubt there's total abuse, and I'd like to get Adam's opinion about this, and I do it with a little bit facetiously, but also it could be pretty practical. Maybe we should have background checks on the people in government who own guns and use guns. 100,000 bureaucrats carrying guns. Why don't we have a background check on them? Why don't we have a background check on the politicians who advocate preemptive war and ignoring the Constitution? They have big guns and they can go to war with them. Why shouldn't we have a pre-check on these guys? And if they harbor these horrible thoughts that we can go to war anytime we want, maybe we should weed them out instead of looking for the ones who are the most hawkish for the government.
Adam, what do you say to that?
I think the opposite has been what's happened is there's been an increase in militarization in the police, not just in the equipment provided by the federal government through various programs to give them armored vehicles, grenade launchers, etc., but also through the training the police undergo, in which the highest priority is officer safety. And instead of knocking on somebody's door to deliver a warrant peaceably, they wait until the person and his family are asleep at home and storm in with a SWAT team of 8 to 20 people, with guns drawn and throwing in smoke grenades and so forth. This is the sort of thing that we have now. We have police that, on a traffic stop, it can escalate into shooting someone with a stun gun or shooting them with a gun. Obama said in his executive action statement that 100,000 people have died in the last years in the United States due to violence with guns. But in the last year in the U.S., about 1,000 people have been killed by police using guns. To put that over a 10-year period, that's about 10% of these deaths that Obama's talking about. And that's an area where government has the most control, like you're saying. The U.S. government, with the FBI agents and all the other armed people from the Park Service to the post office, those are the individuals that need to be taught how to de-escalate situations. They need to be taught how to treat people fairly and not go in there and cause violence. And at the same time, though it shouldn't be under President Obama's authority, state governors and local governments and police chiefs should be making the same prioritization, that the police do not use violence as a first resort and instead try to de-escalate situations. Another thing that could be done on the state and federal level is reduce and eliminate a lot of these crimes, especially in the drug war. If we could end the drug war, then there would be many less police confrontations that have the potential of escalating into death.
I wonder, first came the provision of military equipment to local police officers, military tactics, as you point out, tanks and things of this nature. And then we see such a huge increase in police violence. I wonder if one really does follow the other. You get them to feel like military, feel like they're in this sort of military conflict, and then they start to behave that way.
Yeah, I do think that there's causation there, and definitely there's also financial incentives for some of this. For example, the police have incentives to seize property, and thus they'll pull somebody over for a minor infraction or even a pretext, a made-up infraction, not using a turn signal when changing lanes, or going to a rolling stop at a stop sign, and try to use that interaction in order search the car for drugs or guns or anything of value. So the police motive is moving more and more away from protecting individuals and instead as seeing individuals as a source of income for the department or as people who are a threat to the police. The whole attitude needs to change, and definitely if the police didn't have all these high-tech weapons and didn't have the incentive to use them all the time as well, the attitudes would change. I mean, there could be other, even small steps that could be made. I remember talking to a psychologist who said that maybe if all the police had to wear a little name tag saying their name on it, even that could be a method of de-escalating, because when people have their name out there, they're not as anonymous to the people they stop, and it makes them think a little bit more about treating people in a humane way. There are a lot of things that can be done, but probably the biggest is to...
I'm going to stop it there. Again, that was Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube, RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Subscribe. Now, when we go over the Second Amendment, looking at this at a constitutional way, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Here's a quote. A free people ought not only be armed and disciplined, but they should have sufficient arms and ammunition to maintain a status of independence from any who might attempt to abuse them, which would include their own government. George Washington. It's not hard to understand. It really isn't. So any talk about, well, you know, that's not what the Constitution no, it really is. And you know, there's a meme that goes around and it says, if these, it's got, I forget what his name is, cowboy looking guy, I can't even think of his name right now, but it says, if these fancy politicians treat the people this poorly when you are armed to the teeth, just imagine what they will be willing to do once they have taken away all your guns. And really think about that. Think about how poor people believe that the government treats them, how much they believe that it abridges their freedom. And then some of those people, because they are manipulated, will go, well, we should take the guns away from people. That way we can stop, you know, crime. Like, no, I don't think that works. Okay. Now, if I can get back to where I was here. I didn't lose my... Okay. Couple things that I kind of want to cover here at the end. There is an article out from Washington Post The new way police are surveying you, calculating your threat score. I'm going to cover this one here real quick, if it loads quick enough. This again out of the Washington Post. Fresno, California. While officers raced to a recent 911 call about a man threatening his ex-girlfriend, a police operator in headquarters consulted software that scored the suspect's potential for violence the way a bank might run a credit report. The program scored billions of data points, including arrest reports, property records, commercial database, deep web searches, and the man's social media postings. It calculated his threat level as the highest of 3 color-coded scores, a bright red warning. The man had a firearm conviction and gang association, so out of caution, the police called a negotiator. The suspect surrendered, and police said the intelligence helped them make the right call. It turned out he had a gun. As the national debate has played out over mass surveillance by the National Security Agency, a new generation of technology, such as the Beware software being used in Fresno, has given local law enforcement officers unprecedented power to peer into the lives of citizens. Police officials say such tools can provide critical information that can help uncover terrorists or thwart mass shootings, ensure the safety of officers and the public, find suspects, and crack open cases. They say that last year's attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, California, have only underscored the need for such measures, but the powerful system also have become flashpoints for civil libertarians and activists who say they represent a troubling intrusion on privacy, have been deployed with little public oversight, and have potential for abuse or error. Some say laws are needed to protect the public. In many instances, the people have been unaware that the police around them are sweeping up information, and that has spawned controversy. Planes outfitted with cameras filmed protests and unrest in Baltimore and Ferguson, Missouri. For years, dozens of departments use devices that can hover up all cell phone data in an area without search warrants. Authorities in Oregon are facing an internal investigation after using social media monitoring software to keep tabs on Black Lives Matter hashtags. This is something that has been building since September 11th, said Jennifer Lynch, a senior staff attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. First funding went to the military to develop this technology, and now it has come back to domestic law enforcement. It's the perfect storm of cheaper and easier to use technologies and money from the state and federal governments to purchase it. Few departments will discuss how or sometimes if they are using these tools, but the Fresno Police offered a rare glimpse inside a cutting-edge $600,000 nerve center, even as a debate raged in the city over its technology. An arsenal of high-tech tools. Fresno Real-Time Crime Center is the type of facility that has become the new model for high-tech policing nationwide. Similar centers have opened in New York, Houston, and Seattle over the past decade. Fresno Futuristic Control Room, which operates around the clock, sits deep in its headquarters and brings together a handful of technologies that allow the department to see, analyze, and respond to incidents as they unfold across the city of more than 500,000 in the San Joaquin Valley. On a recent Monday afternoon, the center was a hive of activity. The police radio crackled over loudspeakers, subject armed with steel rod, as 5 operators sat behind banks of screens, dialing up a wealth of information to help units respond to the more than 1,200 911 calls the department receives every day. On 57 monitors that cover the walls of the center, operators zoomed and panned an array of roughly 200 police cameras perched across the city. They could dial up 800 more feeds from the city, school, and traffic cameras, and they hope to add 400 more streams from cameras worn on officers' bodies from thousands from local businesses that have surveillance systems. And, this is something that, yes, civil libertarians are going to get upset because they are literally creating a database that can be used by authoritarian politicians seeking power and to silence opposition. Yes, this is a threat. And law enforcement just goes with whatever laws are passed. They don't question whether they should be doing things enough. The only ones that do usually are the sheriffs, and that's only some of them. But they have a lot of power to kick feds out and things like that. So we need to be aware of that when we're electing sheriffs and be a lot more dedicated into, your county council and your sheriffs and get the libertarians in there. You will see major changes if you're able to do that. But only until you do that. There is a petition out, HoosierCarry.org, Indiana Constitutional Carry petition. So that's something here in the state that I'm located in. Definitely something that would be good to see get passed. So we'll see how that goes. Al Jazeera America terminates all TV and digital operations, and that will happen in April. There was an article out of Mainstream News. Go check it out. Mainstream Media, or Natural News, about mainstream media covering vaccine side effects in pets, but never in humans. There was also an article I didn't get to cover. Obama's chief of staff promises audacious executive action in final year. Something to watch out for. You can find that also in National Review and a lot of other sites. So go check it out. I do want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I don't want people to forget about this network, UCY.TV. This network gives hosts like me and the others here a platform to get you information that the mainstream media does not cover or does not want you to know about. And we try to bring you the message of freedom and be aware and be prepared for things. You can go to UCY.TV and click the support tab and help UCY out. Also, if you scroll down to the bottom of UCY.TV, there's an Amazon button. If you click that Amazon button, you can shop Amazon.com while UCY gets a kickback from your purchases there. And you get the same great deals, same great shipping, while supporting alternative media like UCY.TV. It's very important that you do that because they are trying to censor more and more information getting out. And if it wasn't for alternative media, there's a lot of stuff that still would not be at the surface. And we need to support people that are exposing the corruption and supporting freedom. So go to UCY.TV and supporting UCY is thanking them also from the host here. Also, if you want to help support this broadcast at Anti-Tyranny.news.com, if you go to Anti-Tyranny.news.com/medal, that will take you to Amagi medals. Right now, even though gold and silver are going up, still a great price. Check them out. Thank you all for tuning in and stay tuned here on UCY.TV.